African state of Zimbabwe as
Africa has been politically independent for decades now, if not half a century. But most countries have constitutions, they have presidents, they have armies, they have elections, they have national flags, and they have international recognition on the world stage. They even have seats at the UN, and all formal symbols of sovereignty. But despite that, states' power in many places still feels extremely fragile. A country I could give an example was my dad once worked for an international company, agency, whatever you want to call it, that worked in Liberia for development, an NGO basically, that worked in Liberia. He told me that power still feels so fragile in Liberia, and the government doesn't even fully control the country. And despite all of that, the power is still really fragile with all the investments and all the aid that goes to these countries. And coups still happen, like we've seen in the Sahel with the military coups of 2021 to 2022, giving power to the military. And we've had corruption, and corruption still remains a deeply entrenched issue in Africa that we still have to look into in my next video. Because a good example would be Nigeria, and Nigeria suffers deeply from entrenched corruption and entrenched corrupt elites who do not serve the people but themselves. Armed groups still control territories in certain regions and certain countries. A good example would be Burkina Faso, as 60% of the country is controlled by rebels, or we could say jihadists, who control 60% of the country and actually govern those regions and apply taxes and Sharia law on the local population. In some cases, citizens trust tribes, militias, or local power structures more than the actual government, who's supposed to govern for them, who's supposed to provide them and protect them from the hands of the rebels and jihadists who want to hurt them and who want to impose extreme conditions on these people. So the question, in my opinion, and the question remains, is if colonialism officially ended decades ago, why do so many African states still struggle to fully consolidate power and legitimacy within their own local populations, for God's sake? And I think the problem with the conversation is that people usually go to the extremes. We have some people who blame literally everything on colonialism, and we have other people who ignore colonial history and just blame Africans themselves for all the issues that they face today. And I think both positions are extremely shallow, because the reality is more complicated than that and is more nuanced. So let's go into it together.
Without sound, where the crazy people meet on the street.
Now, first of all, I want to go into this. Colonialism did matter. I think denying that would be dishonest, intellectually dishonest, and academically dishonest for a conversation like this, which is supposed to be nuanced. European colonial powers did not build African states to become stable, self-sufficient democracies one day. Most colonial systems were designed around extraction and control, extracting resources and maintaining order, suppressing resistance. That was the priority of those colonial powers and the colonial structures that were left for Africans to use to govern themselves after independence. That was the priority for them. A lot of infrastructure was built around getting resources out of the country, not necessarily building the country which the resources were being taken from. And integrated national economies were also not intended. And when independence came, many African countries inherited borders and institutions that weren't deeply rooted in political or social realities. In a lot of places, different ethnic groups, languages, religions, and political traditions were suddenly grouped together into one state structure. And a beautiful example would be my home country, Nigeria, which we have the Muslims in the north and the Christians in the south, and we have 300 different ethnic groups, and we have no idea what to do with it. And it doesn't mean that unity is impossible. It just means that what we were given with to work with wasn't going to work in the first place, so now we have to make it work. So I don't want to cause any ethnic divisions, but we just have to make that clear that Nigeria would be a beautiful example of this stability. That's what happened after the colonial past did to us. And building stable national identity under those conditions is also really difficult. And that's just the reality that we have to face. And this is where I think the conversation usually becomes too simplistic. Because colonialism explains part of the story. Because after independence, African leaders still had agency. They still had the ability to make choices that would better impact Africa. That would better impact Africa as a whole and the nation states within Africa, the 54 countries that were within Africa. Governments still made choices, political systems still evolved internally, and internal government's failures matters more than some people want to admit. Because internal agency, internal accountability matters more than colonialism in today's world. Because we were given independence 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago. And you can't tell me that we still have to blame colonialism for everything. At this point, we have to look at our internal structures and elites' accountability. So now we have to go into the real problem, in my opinion. In my opinion, one of the biggest issues across African states is weak institutions, and that's primarily what I think it is. Weak institutions. And I think people underestimate how important institutions actually are when we talk about Africa and we talk about the continent as a whole. Strong countries are not held together by speeches or nationalism alone. We have to build strong institutions. They're held together by systems that people trust. And let's be honest, most Africans don't trust their own governments. They don't trust the institutions that are supposed to take care of them. They don't trust the courts, they don't trust the civil service, they don't trust the police, they don't trust electoral systems, local governments, or public administration. When institutions are weak, politics becomes personal instead of structural. And once politics becomes personal, everything revolves around that individual, around ethnic loyalty, patronage, political survival, instead of long-term governance to improve the health and well-being of the nation. That's why in some countries, when one leader leaves office, the entire political system becomes unstable. And another example I'd like to give is Libya. Once Gaddafi fell in 2011, with no institutions and no formal governments behind him, Libya fell into chaos. It fell into a power struggle, it fell into malicious fighting for control and territory. And this is also why corruption becomes so damaging. In weak states, corruption isn't just people stealing money. It's not just that, but then it slowly destroys public trust in the state itself. Because citizens stop believing rules matter, institutions are fair, or governments still actually serve the public. Instead, the governments serve the elites, the people who pay for them to stay in office, and the people who let them exploit the system for themselves. And once trust disappears, legitimacy starts to collapse too. Now, and this is where coups and instability become more important. A lot of coups don't just happen because soldiers randomly want power. They happen in environments where institutions are already weak and legitimacy is already damaged. Now, obviously, military takeovers are not a good solution to political instability in any country. But if you look at the rhetoric coup leaders use, they almost always justify themselves by saying so many things. And examples would be the government is corrupt, like what happened in Burkina Faso, institutions have failed, insecurity is rising, or elites are disconnected from ordinary citizens. Again, it doesn't justify coups, but it shows that deeper problems in institutional weakness. And honestly, one of the biggest mistakes many post-independence governments made was failing to build systems stronger than individual rulers. Too much political power becomes centralized around personalities. Strong men, political networks, military influence, ethnic alliances, instead of durable institutions. And when states operate like that for decades, instability becomes almost permanent. It becomes almost something that you should expect in a state. Because every political crisis threatens the entire system itself. Another issue is the relationship between resources and accountability. People assume that if a country has oil, gold, gas, or minerals, it should automatically be stable and developed. But that does not always show in politics or how politics even works. In some cases, resource-wealthy nations actually weaken institutions, because governments become heavily dependent on external revenue instead of building productive economies internally. And when governments don't rely heavily on citizens economically, they sometimes feel less pressure to remain accountable to citizens politically. That part is what people call the resource curse in Africa and other countries in Asia and the rest of the world. And foreign aid sometimes creates a similar problem too. Not because aid itself is inherently evil, don't quote me on that, aid is not evil, but because long-term dependency can weaken internal state capacity if governments rely too heavily on outside support instead of developing effective domestic systems and tax systems instead of relying on grants and aid to fund public sectors. Again, this is why governance matters so much for states in Africa. Resources alone do not build strong states. Institutions do. Now, let's discuss why people turn away from the state. And eventually, if governments repeatedly fail to provide security, accountability, and economic opportunity, or basic services, in fact, people stop emotionally investing in the state itself, stop showing up for elections. And that's what happens. And that's when alternative power structures become stronger. Ethnic identity becomes stronger, religious movements become stronger, militias become stronger, informal systems become stronger, because people trust what actually functions in their daily lives and what can actually impact their standard of living. I think this is one of the most misunderstood parts of state fragility. People don't abandon the state because they naturally prefer chaos. No, none of them do. For instance, Libya turned away from Gaddafi due to corruption and because he lost legitimacy in the people. But then they never wanted the instability they have today. They abandoned the state because the state stopped feeling legitimate or effective. And once citizens stop believing institutions can work, rebuilding trust becomes incredibly difficult. So overall, I think the biggest mistake people make when discussing Africa is trying to reduce everything to one explanation. And I do want to reference this. Colonialism did matter a lot, but internal governance matters more. Leadership matters, institutions matter, accountability matters, and political incentives do matter too. And if we ignore those internal problems, we end up treating African societies like they have no agency over their own political future, which I think is deeply inaccurate, because stable states are not created by independence alone. They are created by strong institutions, legitimacy, accountability, and governments that people genuinely trust with their lives and with their own well-being. And until those foundations become stronger, fragility will continue, regardless of how long ago colonialism ended. And remember to subscribe. I'll be dropping more long-form videos at least once a week, giving my opinion on certain African issues. So I'll see you in the next one. Remember to subscribe and give me your thoughts in the comments. I really want to hear what you think. It was nice talking to you guys today. Everything for Africa.